everyone, and welcome. In today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the history of Portland's rail system. This is a video that I have been meaning to make for quite a while, essentially since my first video, which was on the history of the Chicago L system. But I never really had a good map until I went home for the winter holidays this year. And now I have an official map of the rail system, including the three main forms of transportation, two of which we'll be talking about today. Chicago's system, if you're familiar with my first video or with the city of Chicago itself, is quite an expansive system spanning over 100 years and all corners of the city. Portland's, though, has had a much rougher history, a shorter history in terms of the modern era, but one that is similarly optimistic. Before the system that we see in front of us here, like many large cities in America, Portland had a system of streetcars that ran throughout the city and primarily went along the main corridors, along downtown, and away radially from the city. But as the 20th century rolled along, many cities shut down their streetcar lines, and the same was true of Portland as well. It embraced the car-centric urban focus that is familiar to anyone who has studied urban planning, design, and history of America in the 20th century, and frankly, of most places within the 20th century. But by the time we get to the 1970s, the opinion of cars and the opinion of rail had switched places, particularly as the environmental movement began to take root in America, and especially in Portland as part of the Pacific Northwest. And so in the 1970s and 80s, the city of Portland decided to develop a mass transit network, a rail network, on top of the existing bus network. The rail network would be part of the public transit system known as TriMet. And the first stretch and the easiest stretch to build at first because of the funding from the Federal Highway Committee was the Eastside stretch. The name of the rail system is called the Metropolitan Area Express, or MAX for short. It's upside down here, but if we shift over a little bit, we can see that the train system is called the MAX. leave the right way up here on the timetable portion of this chart. And as I was saying, the Eastside Max, as it was called, also known sometimes as the Banfield Max, because a significant portion of the rail system right here was laid on the side of the Banfield Expressway, which is the highway name for Interstate 84 as it goes away from I-5. But this first section from Cleveland Station all the way in the suburb of Gresham, all the way along Burnside Street, and then arcing its way along the Banfield, across the Willamette River, on the Steel Bridge, down First Avenue, and then splitting to run east and west on different streets to obey the one-way streets of downtown Portland. This first section was built in the 80s and was opened to the public on September 5th, 1986, the birthday of the modern rail system in Portland. As I said, it went all the way from Gresham through to downtown, and originally it ended at this pair of stations at Galleria, Southwest 10th Avenue, and Library, Southwest 9th Avenue. These stations have different names because, of course, as you can see, they run on different streets. So going into downtown, the Max runs westbound on Morrison Street, and coming into and out of downtown this way, it went eastbound on Yamhill Street. And at this pair of stations, celebrating the Galleria, which is a mall space in downtown, and the Central Library for the Multnomah County Library System, there was a loop of track that still exists to this day for occasional usage, that loops around so that train cars could loop around and go from the Galleria station to the library station and work their way back. And this was an impressive feat for the city and for urban rail transit in the U.S., despite a number of setbacks, including having to make a significant monetary investment in the Steel Bridge, which the rail project was using to cross the river. Despite this, the original East Side line was under budget and opened early. So, extra thankful for that. The next changes to happen to the network were really to the original line. The first ones you can't even see anymore, because on March 26th, 1990, the mall stations at Southwest 4th and 5th were opened to be adjacent and connect to the Portland Transit Mall, which, like Morrison and Yamhill Streets, are part of the one-way system of streets in Portland, in downtown Portland, but specifically designed so that they would be transit focused. At that point in time, there were no trains like we have here, but they were primarily focused on connecting from Union Station and getting buses in and out of downtown. And so 5th Avenue going southbound and 6th Avenue going northbound became primarily bus lanes. So stations opened at 4th and 5th to allow easier connections to the transit mall. However, due to other stations on the other side of the mall, at Pioneer Square, and the existing stations at Southwest 3rd and at the Yamhill District on the other side, the stations closed in 2020, just before the pandemic. Similarly, the Convention Center station was not part of the original plan, the original opening set of stations for the Eastside Max. But that was primarily because the convention center, the Oregon Convention Center in the Lloyd District, had not yet opened. But in 1990, it did. And on September 20th, 1990, excuse me, September 20th, 1990, the Convention Center station opened for the first time. It, unlike the mall stations, continues to operate to this day. Another upgrade that the Eastside Max got in the 90s was an expansion of the capacity of the East Side section from Ruby Junction, East 197th, to Cleveland. There weren't any new stations added, but originally there was only one track running between these stations when the Eastside Max opened in 1986. And in 1996, a second track was laid so that there could be more capacity in this section. The next year, however, there was an actual expansion. From the far west side stations began the inching forward of the West Side Max, which was delayed by several years compared to the East Side Max, primarily because of political sway and the need to fund the project as well. From the Galleria and Library Southwest 9th. Two new stations were added to the west portion of the track. First at Providence Park, which originally opened on August 31st, 1997 as Civic Stadium, which is the primary station for the baseball and soccer teams in Portland at the time. Now, as the park changed names over the years to PGE Park in 2001, Geraldwin Field in 2011, and to Providence Park in 2014, the station has also changed its name. For the past 10 years, it has been Providence Park. There's also the Kings Hill Southwest Salmon Stop, which opened on the same day, but is now no longer on the map because of its proximity to the next station, as well as to Providence Park. It also closed in 2020. But just over 1 year later, before the closure of that station, the rest of the West Side Max was complete, going all the way from Goose Hollow, South Jefferson Station, through Washington Park and the Sunset Transit Center, through Beaverton, and then finally all the way to Hillsborough at the Hatfield Government Center. This entire section was opened on September 12th, 1998. Roughly 18 years and a week after the original opening of the Eastside Max. And from this point on, the service on this line was still considered to be one single line. But one line to connect the far west side and the far east side of the city. There were, and ever since 1998, have been conversations about extending the rail line westward still to Cornelius and Forest Grove. But the political will and the funding for that project have not been ever seriously considered. Two changes I'll note to this map. If you can see in the smaller writing of each station, many stations, particularly out in the suburbs of Beaverton and Hillsborough and Gresham, are double named with a name for the neighborhood or a road and then an avenue like 158th or 170th. Two stations that once had these added to them are Katama, which used to also be Northwest 205th Street, and Orenco for Orenco Station, which used to be Northwest 231st. Both stations opened with those street names in their station names, but in 2017 they were removed from both. As I said, up to this point, this east-west line was considered a single service. However, that would all change with the new millennium. In 2001, TriMet opened the first branch reaching the Portland airport. This service went through new developments near the airport, as well as to the Park Road Sumner Transit Center, before joining the rest of the Eastside Max and stopping at the original stopping point at Galleria and Library. A year prior, in 2000, it had been announced that this service was going to be designated its own separate service. And this is where we get the current terminology of coloring and naming each service with its own color. So in 2000, this was the birth of the Blue Line for what was the West Side and East Side Max. It is now just the Blue Line and has been. And the service from, at that point, Galleria and Library to Portland Airport became the Red Line. A rather unfortunate part of the history of the Red Line is that it opened on September 10th, 2001. A lot of the celebrations that were planned to commemorate the new line were postponed when U.S. airspace was closed down, and the Portland airport itself also paused operations in the wake of 9/11 the next day. But since then, the Red Line has been a popular place for people to go and use the Max. And it wasn't long for the Red Line service to extend westward as well, from the Galleria and Library stations all the way to Beaverton Transit Center. This happened on September 1st, 2003, almost to the date 2 years after the initial launch of the line. One thing I'll note, actually a couple things that I'll note at this time, since we've gotten to the point of talking about these services as separate lines, is also talk about the type of transit that Max is. Max is considered a light rail service. Its light rail is, at least most commonly and sometimes stereotypically, seen and imagined similar to the streetcars of the 19th and 20th centuries, as well as the modern streetcars of today, with having overhead powering on power lines, as well as primarily being above ground and frequently being on the same level and within a roadway. So this contrasts it with the more common and often more popular among the transit geek and nerd community, and I feel comfortable saying that as a transit nerd myself, of the contrasting form of heavy rail, which is a less common term. Most commonly you'll hear heavy rail referred to as metro systems, subway systems. The main difference to be made between light rail and heavy rail is in the ability of the system to be able to handle heavy or light, relatively, amounts of traffic. So, with being on a roadway and potentially susceptible to the elements, having to contend with roads right of way, light rail is going to be able to handle fewer people than a subway, which is intentionally built to be away from the flow of car traffic, and so it can move at its own pace. The primary exception for that on the Portland system, because most of the stations here are above ground, is Washington Park, which was part of the 1998 expansion. Washington Park is a below-ground station, and it is intentionally so because Washington Park right here is part of what we in the Portland geographical area call the West Hills. The series of hills that form a geographical boundary that cradles the area of downtown Portland on the west side of the river. And Washington Park is quite a way up relative to the elevation of downtown. And so to be able to make the journey from Goose Hollow to Sunset Transit Center, which, although still elevated relative to downtown, is on a much flatter portion of land, there needed to be a tunnel to connect the stations and create a station for Washington Park. And so Washington Park is a unique station on the Max network. But it treats itself well by having a large amount of historical and archaeological history in the walls and elevators of the station, which makes sense considering that Washington Park is, at this point, both a natural wonder and a natural preserve, but also a museum campus of sorts. Back to the history. We left off in 2003 with Beaverton Transit Center seeing red line trains. And our next line is, like the red line, also not entirely free of controversy. In 2004, on May 1st, the yellow line opened. The yellow line was created to follow largely the right-of-way of Interstate Avenue, a north-south street in North Portland. Originally, the yellow line went all the way from the Portland Expo Center, as well as Delta Park, which is a largely sports complex facility, in open air facility. Go down that portion of North Portland, and then follow the red and blue line trains down, and once again stopping at Galleria and Library stations. unlike the Red Line, whose controversy was largely based off of the fact that the circumstances of 9/11. The Yellow Line's controversy was primarily due to the historical, political, and economic de-incentivization of North Portland as a historically black part of the city, including many neighborhoods that have historically been neglected and overlooked by urban improvement policies. On the other hand, the plan for the Yellow Line, primarily based off of the idea of creating a transit line and stimulating growth around the new stations, has been seen by some, and in the 20 years since its debut, still is seen sometimes as part of a larger gentrifying movement within Portland. So, unfortunately, not an ideal situation, but at the very least, it provides an avenue for transit into the city. The next updates to the system were relatively minor in the coming years. In 2007, the Cascades station was opened. Originally, this was planned to be opened as part of the rest of the Red Line. But the investment into the what was at the time a future housing and shopping development was not yet ready at this part of the development by 2001. So while the station had been partially built and existed as a timing stop for trains, it did not open as a proper station until January of 2007. Cascades and Mount Hood now serve the Cascade Station open-air mall complex, which has a number of hotels as well as Portland's IKEA store. The next update from there was on February 4th, 2009, and the former North Portland Boulevard station. In the 2000s, North Portland Boulevard was renamed to Rosa Parks Boulevard in honor of the bus boycotter, as part of the and hero of the civil rights movement. However, it took a couple of years until 2009 for the station along what formed the former Portland Boulevard, now Rosa Parks Way, to actually be named in honor of the street it was on. Curiously, on maps, instead of being Rosa Parks Way Station, it is listed as just Rosa Parks. But 2009 did not disappoint. Because even though in February all that happened was a name change, on September 12th of 2009, a significant change occurred. But before that, we have to talk about what happened in August 30th of 2009. I previously mentioned the Portland Transit Mall as a primarily bus-oriented transit set of streets on 5th and 6th Avenues. But in 2009, TriMet added rail to go up and down the transit mall. And on August 30th, the transit mall opened, first with the realignment of the yellow line no longer along Morrison and Yamhill Streets, but instead to take the transit mall, going down south on 5th Avenue, circling back at Montgomery and Mill stations, and then going back north along 6th Avenue. But it was not alone for long, because joining it on September 12th was the Green Line, Portland's 4th line, which also started at Mill and Montgomery Streets. Also traveled north and south along the transit mall and across the Steel Bridge. But instead of joining the Yellow Line northbound, the Green Line followed the Banfield portion of the Eastside Max until Gateway Transit Center, then went south along Interstate 205, I-205, through southeast Portland, including the neighborhood of Lentz and the suburb of Clackamas, reaching all the way to Clackamas Town Center Transit Center, which is a primarily bus and now rail-oriented center at the Clackamas Town Center Mall. This was a significant change for the rail network, but it has largely been taken in stride and has been successful at creating a four-direction rail network in downtown Portland. The next year, on December 1st, 2010, Civic Drive, a also urban development-based station out in Gresham, was opened, similar to Cascades, years after the urban development plans came to little fruition. The station also partially existed as of the refurbishments of the late 90s and early 2000s, but it became a station in its own right in 2010. And then, 2 years later, in 2012, the Transit Mall got a slight extension from Mill and Montgomery Streets to Jackson and College Streets. I am going to add another map on top of ours to go through this detail. So this is the Transit Mall as it exists. as of 2023. And we can see here the alignment going around to Union Station area, and then down 5th and up 6th. I'll raise the map so that way we can see better. The main area of focus for the developments of 2012 are centered in the south portion of the mall. Like I said, originally the mall, or the rail portion of the mall, stopped at Mill and Montgomery Streets at the PSU Urban Center, or the primary memorial hall for Portland State University. And it took the other 3 years for TriMet, the city of Portland, and Portland State University to agree to a redevelopment plan for the southern portion of Portland State University, which is why it took until 2012 for the looping of the green and yellow lines to go from Mill and Montgomery to the PSU South stations, now at Jackson and College Streets. But you'll notice on this map that the green and yellow lines are not the only lines in the Transit Mall, because now, as of September 12th, 2015, we have the orange line. The 5th line was created primarily as a connector from to downtown and to the suburb of Milwaukee on the southeast side. You can see here on the southern portion of the map that we have the right-of-way here crossing to the south waterfront area. Crossing the limit not on the steel bridge, but on the Telecom crossing, which we can also see here in this city center inset. Trace the orange line across the Telecom crossing. The Bridge of the People, primarily subtitled that because Telecom is Chinakwawa, or Chinook jargon for the people. And from OMSI, the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, the orange line continues to move down along Southeast Portland, inner Southeast Portland, all the way to downtown Milwaukee. And that is it for the history of maps. There have been a number of proposals for the extension of maps. Some that we've talked about, including the extension from Hillsborough down to out to Forest Grove. There's been a proposal for a southwest Portland line going down Barber Boulevard. But so far, none of these plans have come to fruition just yet. I'll touch on two other things actually three other things while we have our maps open. You may have noticed on the southwest section in Beaverton, there's this black line that I have not mentioned yet. And that is the companion service to Max, which is WES, the West Side Express service. This is a service, a train line, like Max, but specifically designed primarily based off of the schedule to be for commuters. For people specifically taking journeys from Beaverton through southern Beaverton, like Hall Street at the Nimbus campus, to Tigard, to Tualatin, and as far south as Wilsonville, where the train system connects to the transit systems of Wilsonville, as well as the northernmost extensions of the transit system in Salem. The WES has been in service since February of 2009. It has also had its share of controversy, primarily because of the suburban nature of its routes and the fairly, to put it bluntly, NIMBY-ish tendencies of the inhabitants of the area. There has also been the fact that it is a relatively poorly used train line, and ridership has not picked up in the years since COVID, as have the riderships of other lines in the overall Tri-Met rail system. And yet it still exists, and it still runs, and we can be thankful for that. Two last things that I'd like to point out. Are companions to Max, other companions to Max in the broader increased transit scheme of Portland. One is the Portland streetcar, which is a set of 3 services that run in the center of the city. These are more traditional streetcar services, and they run on less frequencies than Max. But they are still a decent portion of the overall transit network. And frankly, they should have their own video once I'm able to find a good enough map for them. And lastly, as of September of 2022, so just over a year as of recording this, there is now a bus rapid transit line bridging the gap between the regularity of rail and the dependency of a bus service. This is what TriMet is so far branding as the frequent express or FX service. And so far there is one line, the FX2 line, which has replaced the bus 2 going down Division Street in southeast Portland, going all the way to downtown Portland. As you can see on the larger map of Portland, which you can't see a lot of because I am currently zoomed in a lot more than I am normally. This green line is Division Street, and its bus service is more frequent and with fewer stops than the other bus lines in the network. So it is part of the, it is currently Portland's only bus rapid transit line. But with so far the decent success of the line, there is potential for future BRT lines in the future, in Portland's future. And there we have it. That is the history of the Max system, including the West system, brief touch on the streetcar, and bus rapid transit in Portland. I hope this video has been educational for you. Researching it for it was certainly educational for me, and confirmed a number of things that I knew about the history of Max, but also taught me some new things as well. Thank you all for watching, and have a wonderful rest of your day.